Tom.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and salam, wherever you're watching us from. Welcome to MACFEST 2025 in partnership with Manchester City of Languages. Tell us in the chat where you're watching us from. We're based all over the world today, in Singapore, Austria, France, Germany, and in the UK. A little announcement before we go on. MACFEST is opening the submission process for the MACFEST Muslim National Arts Awards for all the artists, Muslim artists based in the UK, and also for those Muslim artists who would like to join the Muslim Artist Network. So please look on MACFEST website and on Muslim Women's Arts Foundation website for that. So today's event is part of the Youth Festival. It's the second digital event for MACFEST 2025. And what is a better way to start the festival than giving a platform to the great creative minds of the future generations. Our host for today is Ioana Aminian. He was, until 2020, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Manchester, where he founded and led the Multilingual Manchester Project. He is now affiliated researcher at the Aston Institute of Forensic Linguistics in Birmingham, the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Hamburg, and the Department of Hebrew Language at the University of Haifa. He held fellowships with a number of research institutions, including the British Academy and the Anser Institute for Advanced Study. His research has focused on multilingualism, language policy, and minority languages of Europe and the Middle East. His most recent book is Speech and the City, Multilingualism, Decoloniality, and the Civic University. He speaks over a dozen languages fluently, including Arabic, Romani, Turkish, Kurdish, and Hebrew. Over to you, Yaron.
Well, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Katarina, for this very generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to host this event. We go back a long time with MACFEST since its founding in 2018. I was one of the speakers at the very first event, and I believe I was one of the first, perhaps the first non-Muslim speaker at a MACFEST event, and I've been there ever since. And of course, I have a strong connection with Muslim culture. I've lived in Manchester in England for many, many years and worked very, very closely with Muslim populations on their languages. But I also grew up in Jerusalem, which is one of the most important cities for Islam, neighboring Muslim cultures and languages. And it's very close to my heart since my childhood. So I feel very, very immersed. Very excited always to be part of these events and to be in conversation both with a Muslim audience and of course an international audience of various backgrounds. Let me just very briefly introduce our panelists for this evening, and then we will come back to them one by one with initially a couple of questions each, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion, cross comments, and then toward the end we'll open up for questions. If you wish, you can already put your questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring them and we'll take them up later on. So put them up as they occur to you as we go along. So our first panelist this evening is Mukhtar Omar Mukhlis, who is a student in his final year of secondary school in Birmingham. Dr. Ioana Aminian, who is a researcher in linguistic ethnography at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. Anser, who has been involved in training business leadership for many years in a variety of programs. And John Claughton, who is a retired school principal from Birmingham and the founder of Wallo, World of Languages of the World, one of the most exciting, innovative, and novel initiatives to engage young people with languages. One of the most exciting initiatives that I know of and have witnessed and read materials of. So we're going to have various perspectives from not just various parts of the world, but various sectors of work and learning, and I'm really, really excited. So welcome to everyone again, and thank you for taking the time across various time zones and different times of the day and your working day. Let me start with you, Mukhtar. You're, as I said, a student in your final year of secondary school in Birmingham. And first of all, let's start with your personal experience at home. You grew up in a bilingual environment. Your home languages are English and Malay. And as a bilingual, you reflected on how language can shape your experience of the world. And this is, of course, a very, very big topic. There's been both in everyday conversations, we hear about, can we exactly translate things from one language to another? Do languages have words that are completely equal? And all the way into the academic discussions where people have been reflecting now for almost 100 years. Does language shape the way you view the world? And so I'm just kind of wondering, what's your personal experiences with that? How did you navigate growing up between two languages, and how do you express yourself in your two languages?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. I think I've spoken about it before, but the main way that I experienced a difference in comfort, perhaps, is between these two languages is switching between a home environment and a school environment. That was the first place where I experienced that difference in feeling of language. When I grew up, I first started speaking both Malay and English, but I would speak English with a Malay accent. But then, as I spent more time in an English school setting, that shifted, and I'd put on an English accent. I'd speak more English both at school and at home as well, and eventually it sort of flipped on its head, and so English was the dominating language for me because I was in an English environment, so it was more advantageous for me to prioritize that second language over my mother tongue. But then as I grew up, I felt like I was at a loss. When I interacted with my family, when I came home from school, home is a place where you want to feel comfortable, where you want to feel like you can relate to the people there, your family members. But there was a barrier that previously I felt wasn't there, and it was a very much linguistic based barrier because suddenly I felt like I couldn't articulate myself properly to my family members. And sure, I could articulate myself amazingly with my teachers, with my friends outside of the house, but with my family, the people who I should be closest with, there was something that I couldn't use to relate to them. And so that's where it was very much a more conscious decision and a more conscious effort to focus more, to put more time and energy into expressing myself in Malay, whereas it was a more unconscious shift from Malay to English. But I got there in the end, I think. But yeah, I think nowadays I still the biggest way in which I experience that shift is humor, is comedy, telling jokes. I think I'm not as funny in Malay as I am in English. It just because it works different, because obviously different languages have different ways in which they work, and different cultures have different standards of comedy. So I'll say a joke, but I'll directly translate it into Malay, and it doesn't work. It doesn't have the same effect because the words sound clunky, or it's just a different turn of phrase or whatever. And whereas in English I might be met with laughter, I often my family sort of like looks at me blank and is like, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" But yeah, that's how it's processed.
Are there particular concepts that you can think of that are easier to express in one language or another? I just want to give an example. In some languages, the word for brother and sister has to distinguish whether they are older than you or younger than you. So, for example, Arabic or Turkish, if you talk about your sister, you have to say, this is my older sister, my younger sister. So sometimes there's also neutral words for that. Can you think of a concept that you think you're missing a word in one of your languages because there's more differentiation in one language and less in another?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for brother, sister, in Malay, in Kelantanese Malay, the dialect that I speak, the word for little brother or little sister is the same as adik. But then you have a distinction in gender when you talk about older siblings. So there's a separate word for older sister, kakok, and for older brother, abe. And that gender distinction isn't expressed in the younger the respective younger
the other siblings, right?
Yeah.
And that is so interesting because you said the word for older brother is abe, right? If I understood you correctly.
Abe, yeah.
Abe.
Yeah.
In Turkish, it's abe, and that comes from arabe, which is the aga, sir aga, sir lord or sir landlord or something like that. And so we actually have a distribution of words across languages in various cultural spheres, where languages that are not even related will have a similar concept, and that's interesting, and that can also bring people together when they compare. I just want one thing before we move to another question that I wanted to ask you. I introduced you as a speaker of Malay because that's what you told me before, and now you introduced the concept Cantonese Malay, and that I haven't heard before. Can you just explain this briefly? What is Cantonese Malay?
Kelantanese Malay, yeah. It's from the
Kelantanese Malay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah,
that's okay. That's all right.
That's regional. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the dialect of Malay spoken in the state of Kelantan, which is where my family is from.
That's clear, right? I got confused. I didn't hear you properly. There was some
yeah. But yeah, so there's regional differences as well.
I see. Yes, of course. So onto another topic. You've recently written an essay at a school essay that was devoted to the topic of how we can reclaim certain terms in language that can then be a source of empowerment. Tell us a little bit about that. What does it mean to reclaim a term, first of all, in language?
I mean, in the essay, I used the example of for Black people, the N word, the N slur. That originally was used as a term of great insult by white people against Black people, but as time progressed, the Black community reclaimed that word, as in used that word themselves to describe themselves in their own language, in their own vernacular, which sort of took something that was weaponized and almost drained it of the power that white people wielded and redirected the power back to them. So in a sense that it seems very simple, just taking a word that somebody else has used and using it yourself, but the fact that you yourself are using a term that was meant to be used against you represents and also facilitates a shift in the power dynamic. So that was one of the examples. There are other terms like there are some terms relating to misogynistic ideas, terms used against women that are now used by women they're now positive descriptors. What were once like terms associated with negativity, terms that were meant to paint femininity as this negative quality, are now being used by proponents of femininity and the feminine to promote a more positive image of femininity by using the same terms, but by flipping the negativity on its head.
But it's interesting that even though you are speaking analytically as an observer about these processes, you've written about them, you've observed, you've collected material, and you're telling us how people who are within particular population sectors or ethnic groups, how they embrace and so reclaim those terms for themselves, you are still hesitating to actually cite the terms. You've referred to the N-word, and I don't want to cite it because I don't want to now cause offense. But so my question is, if we are observers and analysts and are looking at these developments and assessing them, and if other people are using them and embracing them and reclaiming them, is it right for us to continue to avoid them, or can we join in and use the same terms that these sectors are using and say, well, they've now been reclaimed, it's okay for us to use them as well?
Well, no, I don't think so, personally, because reclaiming is done by the people who against whom that term is used. Once it has been reclaimed, you as an outsider using that term is not contributing to that reclamation at all, because you can't contribute to reclamation if you weren't part of the group against whom it was used, in my opinion.
But no, I understand that, but that means that we have very rigid boundaries around groups, and our boundaries are rigid. You know, sometimes there is some fluidity, and people can say, "Well, I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that." But I suppose it's a matter of identification. So that's interesting. It reminds me of a discussion that I was hosting another online discussion last night with a sociology professor from the University of Illinois in Chicago. And she's a Jewish professor of sociology, and most of her academic work and her activism has been on gender equality and feminism. And she was telling us how about anti-Semitism on campuses in the US since the October 7th, and how that was a problem for her. And she was saying how she grew up in the US. She never particularly identified as Jewish. She's of Jewish background, never really had any connection to Israel, didn't define herself as Zionist. And she thought that the term Zionist for her actually had connotations of identifying with aggressive policies of Israel. So she didn't use it and certainly didn't identify with it and didn't define herself as Zionist. But she says the past year, the term has been used so much in an offensive and undifferentiated way that she has decided to reclaim it and all of a sudden define herself as Zionist, even though she continues to be very critical of Israel's policy. But she says, I want to reclaim that term for myself. And I wonder if that sometimes works also with political terms, but we can come back to that later in the discussion and think about that and other examples. And let's move on to Ioana. Thank you, Mukhtar. We'll come back to you definitely in the discussion as well. Ioana, you're joining us from Vienna, and thanks again for being here. You're a researcher in linguistic ethnography, and you've worked in different parts of the world, and in recent years, particularly among the Kalmuks, who are a Mongolic ethnic group, if one can say so. They speak a language that is related to the Mongolian languages in the Russian Federation. And you've also worked among the Sephardic Jews of Istanbul in Turkey, who speak or spoke until recently a language that some people refer to as Judeo-Spanish, very closely related to Spanish, but a Jewish variety. Some people call it by other names like Ladino or Judesmo. And we hear a little bit about your research, and especially about the how your research has offered an opportunity for observations about people's attitudes toward their language and how identity is projected onto language in different ways. But before we come to that point, maybe tell us just a little bit about what is actually linguistic ethnography. What kind of a method or academic discipline is linguistic ethnography? What do you do as a linguistic ethnographer, and what questions do you try to interrogate?
Hello, thank you everybody for having me. It's a pleasure to be in this be discussing about this very important issues about language and power, multilingualism. So I would say more I'm a social linguist. I think I use less the term linguistic ethnography, but it's just, yeah, it's maybe more or less the same. So I look at language through the perspective of social dynamics and the dynamics of its speakers, embedding language within social demographic, social historical context. So put more or less in a few words. And yes, shall I transition to the communities or?
Well, maybe just can explain again sorry, a bit more, what does a linguistic ethnographer do? If we have people in the audience, young people who are considering a career or something to study, what would I do if I become a linguistic ethnographer? What's going to be my task?
So I've been looking, for example, in the past years at the relationship between language and identity, and how this relationship is shaped among different endangered language groups, like the Kalmyk, like the Boyash, like the Sephardim. And I've been looking at attitudes and how these are shaped or how intergenerational language transmission has taken place. More specifically, I've been looking into factors that caused a language shift and the effects of language shift on the different generational cohorts of speakers, semi-speakers, non-speakers.
What does language shift mean?
Well, language shift is when we transition from, like in a minority majority context, when we transition from speaking one language to adopting another language. And these boundaries between speaking a language and not speaking a language, they're not very clear because it's an axis of processes in fluency from fluent speakers to non-fluent speakers or heritage speakers. They're very different categories of how we can describe certain types of speakers based on the fluency.
Mm-hmm. So you've looked, so basically, is it fair to say that language shift often occurs in communities that are, in a sense, disempowered? So they embrace the language or full nation or society that's around them because they have to know that language in order to advance their education and careers and sometimes even mere existence. Sometimes they're under pressure directly to do that. Sometimes it's just an inclination, an opportunity. And so they abandon the language that they spoke before in favor of the more powerful language. And how does that affect, in your experience in the communities that you worked in, how does that affect identity? Do people really always project identity to a single language, or is it possible to say my identity consists of identifying with several different languages?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because depending on the language community, this perception and understanding and shape of the relationship between language and identity can be very different. And if we look at the Sephardim in Istanbul, who were historically multilingual, if we go back in the 1930s, one Sephardic individual would speak, for example, French, Judeo-Spanish as his native tongue, would maybe have Bulgarian knowledge, Greek knowledge because of their neighbors, Bulgarian because of the history of migration of his or her grandparents, Turkish to a certain extent, English, so depending on the high school, also Italian maybe. So we have a high variety of repertoires used for different domains. And in this particular context, the relationship between language and identity is very much shaped by these different linguistic repertoires. When language suppression happened in Turkey, is the foundation of the Turkish Republic, for example, individuals chose different paths and different ways how to assimilate. So certainly there was a way of assimilation. They adopted Turkish. They tried to hide their ethnic identity because it was dangerous, because there was verbal assault, because there was physical assault towards Turkification. And individuals would choose to change their name, assimilate linguistically, and demark their ethnic identity in social interaction through language. So yeah, this is one scenario. And then in the Kalmyk scenario, we could say that the relationship between the heritage language Kalmyk and the Kalmyk identity is much stronger, because they didn't have other language repertoires at hand with whom to identify. So they either identified with Russian, the dominant language, and then adopt strategies of demarking again their identity in acquiring proficiency in Russian and native proficiency, and but still, yeah. And the other group would then have a stronger connection to their heritage language and still preserve Kalmyk.
So let's go back and combine these impressions with the question before about linguistic ethnography. Very briefly, can you tell us about those two communities that you worked in recent years, and what do you actually do when you there? How do you get these impressions and these assessments of what's going on when you say people embrace this identity, they have that, you know, this is what they aspire to? How do you know that? How do you collect those impressions? What's your method?
So I use several methods when I go there. My first trips into the communities are to get to know those communities first, to have a first impression. I would go at some central focal points in the community, like temples, some language clubs, maybe some contact persons from the university with whom we would propose an exchange on an institutional basis. And from there, gradually, we would have some first interviews with people that are around these contact persons, and then gradually returning to the field. My strategy was to return to the field every year for a few months, and do this in different sequences.
The field means in this terminology, the place where people live.
Exactly,
right?
like in Kalmykia or Turkey. Yes.
Yeah.
And there it is, always the linguistic insecurity, which I also sense when I speak English, or which we maybe talk today. Yes, so I would go gradually, and especially in the Sephardic community in Istanbul was particularly difficult because of the history of anti-minority and anti-Semitism. And I was granted access to community members maybe after 2 to 2.5 years. It was an extremely lengthy process, other than with the Kalmyks, because I needed to go through, through a lot of discussions, informal discussions, before I got to do the in-depth interviews. And this is one type of data acquisition. I would make an interview where I would ask a few guiding questions, and then in the ideal way, I will just listen to the speaker and see how these speakers embed what I want to pursue, like language attitudes or their language biographies, in a longer narrative, where then I can analyze different factors of language.
So you speak to people, you've got some questions that you prepare in advance, you guide them to talk about their experiences, and then you work with that. So you basically let the people that you were interested in tell their stories, their life stories, and you interpret that. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Again, we'll come back to you, I'm sure, in the discussion, and let's move on to Anser. Anser, you're joining us from Singapore. Very different time zone. Thank you very much for staying there so late on. And you're based in Singapore, but you also spend time, and you've trained in the UK, and you grew up in Pakistan, and you work for one of the largest multinational business organizations. You lead the Global Learning and Leadership Center at Unilever. And before that, you had, in a different stage of your working life, you had a career in marketing and product branding. So we want to look at that and explore a little bit through your perspective and your lens, What does language mean in large multinational businesses? And what does it mean in product branding? So first of all, the first question on that, in the business world, multinational companies, I'm sure, need different languages, but they can't work with all the languages. I don't know if everybody knows that's listening in, but we estimate as linguists that there are about 6,000 languages in the world. It's a bit tricky because how do you count? How do you differentiate? Norwegian and Swedish are different languages, very, very similar. Urdu and Hindi are very, very similar, almost identical languages, but written differently. But that said, something like several thousand languages. And we know that there's about 200 states, countries in the world. So obviously most countries in the world are multilingual, extremely multilingual. And I'm sure that multinational companies cannot work with all the languages in the world, or not even with anywhere close to that. So how are languages prioritized in international communication of large organizations? Which languages get attention? What are the criteria for prioritizing languages? And what happens? How do you work with languages that get less attention? And what are the consequences or risks that you take for that?
Thanks, Sharon. Delighted to be here. And absolutely, in the business world, we have to sometimes take some very critical calls, especially when it comes to communication. And in a company like mine, where we are in 192 countries globally, we do have a strong global presence. However, at the same time, we are cognizant of the fact that a lot of things can get lost in translation. So if you lean very heavily in the other direction and you try and translate in even 20 and no more than those 6,000 languages, there is a risk that sometimes the message gets diluted. So the truth often lies somewhere in the middle, where typically when we have a live call, which is the equivalent of our virtual town hall that we tend to have once a quarter now, 4 times a year, where the global CEO addresses the global audience, there are 2 things we're doing. One is the language itself. So it's translated in 7 languages, 7 top languages where our heaviest populations reside. And depending on what the topic is, it's either top 5 or top 7, and that allows us to reach at least 65% of our audience. But then another very effective tool that we use is a visual tool, where it's not just about passive listening, but we encourage people who dial into these calls to share back what their understanding is through Pigeonhole, through Q&A, to even share on a softboard what they're hearing. And visually, we try and capture people in all the major hubs, and we will showcase them very much like we're showcasing each of the speakers now, where we'll see 100 or 300 people in a particular room. And it just kind of shows that, okay, despite the language barriers, people are getting into the spirit of whatever the topic is. Having said that, there are challenges, and that's where we depend on our local leaders to then have a secondary town hall in the afternoon, where they will then address the larger audience, the factory audiences, people who are not able to dial into the central sort of town hall, and ensure that the message is reaching and it's being translated well, especially with the cultural context, which is very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I recently spoke to somebody who works for a large company in the aviation industry. And obviously there's a lot of technical challenges there, but they told me that there is a policy to use what they call a simplified English. And there's quite a lot of manuals for the company to ensure that language is not a barrier, while yet keeping English as the international language that everybody uses. Is that something you come across? So a wish to, an attempt to engineer a language in some way or other to intervene with not just which language is used in which cultural context, but also what the shape of the language should be to make it more accessible? Is that something that you've come across in either your training or your work experience?
Indeed, we do make an effort, especially in the trainings, that we simplify the message. Not only the simple words, but even fewer words if possible. And that's where I would call it broken English, but where you don't care too much about the filler words, but you will just say the main words so the message is conveyed. But then another tool, Yaron, that's been very useful for us is what I would call the distinction between delivery, as in spoken language, delivery and discussion. So what we often allow in a lot of our trainings is that while the language of communication remains English, and our facilitators and our trainers will speak in English, we will allow for discussions within the groups to be in the local language, whether it's Telugu or Arabic or Hindi. And surprisingly, that's very effective because a lot of people's ability to understand certain words to a large degree is quite high, but their ability to converse in it profoundly limits what they can express. But the moment you allow them to freely converse in their language, agree, especially in Asian cultures, it works very well. And then one of their spokespersons might summarize back in English. And that is something that has found us just the right medium of allowing that debate and discussion, but then delivery is still in English.
I really find that fascinating because there is some sense, when you're outside the sector and there's a lot of reports on that in the media and elsewhere, of English taking over. From a linguistic point of view, people who work like Ioana in linguistic ethnography and on languages that are endangered, so smaller languages that have less power, we sometimes say, well, English has taken over and all the other languages are disappearing. But in fact, computer-mediated communication has opened up opportunities for smaller languages that don't have a state, that sometimes didn't have a writing system. People just use them freely because they have exactly that notion of comfort that you've been telling us about. They have that naturally because they can use that in social media, and that gives their language a new platform where it can expand. And you've now been telling us that this can be done intentionally as a matter of policy. Let's give people their comfort for their language and use it as they wish. And it's very interesting. We're talking about language and empowerment, and we started off talking about how you reclaim. So you go sort of against the powers in order to challenge the powers and keep your own identity, or you resist language shift, you build that. But we're now seeing that even in the, what we sometimes think of very powerful big corporations, empowerment can come top down as well. We give you the opportunity to feel comfortable in the language repertoire. So that's really fascinating. Let's move on to the issue of branding. Branding and marketing is very much connected to words and labels and names. And they are often, and perhaps more often than not, very culture specific. So what we associate with certain names and with certain words, and they are from a particular language in a particular context. But you want to, in the branding industry and in the marketing industry, you want to reach as wide as audience as you can. And one way to do that is to say, well, everybody should know English and should understand the English cultural context and embrace it. But is there another way? Is there any consideration given to, can we translate brands, or can we make them, design them in such a way that they would appeal to people in various linguistic and cultural contexts? What's your experience with that?
Indeed, it's a beautiful question. And as a former marketer, I can tell you I've lost a lot of hair, and a lot of the white in my beard has come just for that reason, because I've had the good fortune to work across different countries, languages, and cultures. I've spent 8 years in the Middle East. And often what I found was that while I thought and wrote in English, when we had to go and test a concept with consumers, which is what we typically do long before a product is designed and brought to shelf, we actually do our research, and we conduct our research obviously with local housewives and local homes. And that's where you need to write a concept card, and you take it to them with some visuals, and you want to know whether it's a toothpaste or a shampoo or an ice cream flavor, how they react to it. And so much, Aaron, is lost in translation. So it's really down to the difference between translation and transliteration. And often my biggest nightmare is working with translation agencies. That's who we use. But typically, they're supposed to take on 90% of the weight. They only do 10%. And then people like myself have to lean in and do the 90% because they will literally transliterate. And that's when the concept not only loses meaning, sometimes it can be offensive, sometimes it can just change the meaning completely. And that's where we feel that taking in the cultural view and really bringing in the nuances of the local language to then convey the original intended message or the pun because a lot of marketing has to be catchy and it's supposed to be getting a certain reaction. So just to give you an example, in my company, one of the biggest laundry platforms, whether you'll know it as a different brand depending on which part of the world you are, whether it's Persil or Omo or Surf, but the platform internally is known as Dirt is Good, which is counterintuitive, but that's deliberate because we're trying to say, go make memories. So what if you get dirty and you play in the sand with your kids? Build memories, we'll take care of the stains. But the platform name is Dirt is Good. Now, when that is translated in Urdu or Hindi, for India and Pakistani audiences, the literal translation would infer very negative connotations, because dirt is translated as matti or mud or ghalazat, which is really, really shunned upon. Whereas we had to change it slightly, and instead of dirt is good, we translated it to daag achhe hain. Daag means stains. Stains are good. So that makes sense in the local Indian, Pakistani context, that, okay, stains can be good if they've been achieved for a certain purpose. Go help your elders, even if you get dirty in the process, we will take care of the stains, but not dirt. But in the English context, dirt is good is more attractive versus stains. So those little nuances can make such a big difference. It's literally transliteration versus translation.
Right. Well, thank you. That's fascinating, and I think again gives us another angle and another sector from which to view languages and its nuances. And we come to John. John, you're joining us from the Midlands, right, in England tonight. Is that right? And we have gone through our panelists in approximate order of age and life experience, and in various cultures. No, I was just about to say that it's not about it at all. On the contrary, but in many cultures, be it Muslim cultures, Romani cultures, others, life experience is something that is very, very highly valued. And we look at people with a longer life experience to benefit from their wisdom and their views and again the range of experiences that they've had. So I don't think it's a watch it at all. It's coming to you at this point in the conversation is a sign of respect from that cultural perspective. And I've made that introduction because I'd like to ask you specifically something about your work, of course, but also I'd like to ask you that while you're telling us about your work, if you could also reflect back on what we've heard from our other panelists and help us put some of the things in context, if you can. What have they said that is meaningful to you and that you can associate perhaps with other experiences that you've had, or a message that we can use for education? You've been an educator your whole working life, and you're still an educator. So let's start with your role as an educator. While you're thinking about your comments and evaluation of the other panelists' contributions. So I'd like to first of all ask you a somewhat like provocative question, but I know you and I know about your work, and I think that you'll be happy with this question. And my question to you, first of all, as an opener, is what is wrong with the way we teach languages at schools today, if we take the example of English and perhaps also beyond?
Well, I don't know. How long have you got? Thank you,
About 15 minutes to start.
No, I was looking the essay as to what's wrong with how we teach language. Could I first of all start by thanking you, Ioana, for the support and interest you've shown in the work that we have been doing in trying to talk about language education. And I'd also like to claim some credit for Mukhtar, who is, I'm proud to say, a pupil of the school where I was once head, and also once in 1970, a boy. So we are, Mukhtar and I are part of a great tradition that goes back to the one of the great linguists and communicators, J.R.R. Tolkien. And Mukhtar has contributed a great deal, as Ioana has, in our journey thinking about languages. And Anser, it's interesting, one of the people who connected me to Manchester, first of all, is a man who studied there and has been a benefactor of Manchester University, whose company is the largest patent translating company in the world. And even these days, he says that AI can only do 70%, that human beings have to get the right tone, the right nuance for that thing. In answer to your question, I can only talk really with any great knowledge of England, because I'm a monolingual English person who spent all of his life teaching in English schools. I think, talking about language and power, I suppose in this country, one of the issues has been, this is a very live issue, and I think that Yaron's book, Speech in the City, with an excellent title, but also quite good content, leads us into it, which is, in the UK, there is a sense that there has always been a hierarchy. I studied Latin and Greek at school, and therefore I was a sort of super creature, which is why briefly I got a job in a bank, although I knew nothing about money and cared even less. But because I had a very good degree in classics, then I must be clever. That's obvious. And then you have modern foreign languages, which have a higher status, although they are in real decline and problems in Britain for a number of different reasons. But then also you've got Mukhtar representing an extraordinary story whereby throughout almost all of my teaching life, little or no regard has been paid to the increasingly rich diversity of the linguistic knowledge of the pupils who sit in front of us. And therefore one of the things that's wrong is that, in a sense, there's a league table of languages in the system, English education system, which probably goes back, well, I would argue, to the time of Henry VIII, whereby, you know, Latin and French and Greek and Italian were noble things, but learning, you wouldn't want to learn anything else. And I think one of the things we've been trying to do with our project has been to, in a sense, to ask the question, if we have such linguistic experience and richness in our pupils, why is it that those, whatever you call them, heritage or family languages, why is it that they are, to all intents and purposes, excluded from schools, excluded from the school curriculum, not talked about? And Mukhtar would give very good examples of his work in primary schools. And so, going back to identity, one of the problems is that if we have children with very rich cultural linguistic backgrounds, which they are suppressing, as Mukhtar would describe, and yet we're trying to teach them languages like French and German and Spanish, which has little or no relevance. First of all, we may be turning them off school, but also we are taking away from those pupils their sense of identity, their sense of belonging, and also the idea that what they learn in school is relevant to their own lives, their own past and their own present and their own future. So I think there's a need, which I think your work in Manchester with MACFEST is really important. There's a need for a much more intelligent, thoughtful approach about the nature of our societies, the nature of our communities, and how our education and the teaching of languages can address the kids who are there, as opposed to the ones who were there in, when I was a boy.
Well, tell us a little bit then about your answer to some of this. You're the co-founder of WALO, stands for World of Languages and Languages of the World. So we've got a nice symmetrical iteration there.
Excellent.
And you've begun, although there are people around the world in some languages that have great difficulties pronouncing the sound W. So I think once you start internationalizing, and I'm sure Anser can help us brand that, perhaps give us some advice, you might have to get used to Volov and Folov and others. But for the time being, it's WALO. And what does WALO do? What's the consideration behind it? What have you been developing, and what has been the feedback and the reactions and on the implementation so far?
Well, I don't want you knocking my brand, and Anser should be proud of it, because I think a palindromic acronym WALO is the best brand I've seen in a long time, particularly with a hippopotamus as our symbol. Put simply, we feel that when children are learning languages in English terms in primary school, that instead of trying to teach them a different language, a single language, which they may continue in secondary school, which the teacher may or may not be very good at, why don't we create a language course which talks about languages, how they work, how they came to be like this, why they are similar and why they are different, how language learning can be about code breaking, whatever, but also, above all, making use of the rich linguistic diversity of the pupils so that they can talk about their languages, how they relate, and in so doing, talk about their own history and culture. So therefore, we begin to see that language is absolutely core to everybody's life, is relevant to every single subject, as opposed to something which is parked for 45 minutes on a Friday afternoon. And so basically, over a period of a few years, we have just created these resources, and there can be sign language lessons, there are Braille lessons, there are lessons about how to learn, can we work out the Greek alphabet? There are lessons about why do different cultures, different countries have different days of the week? And this gives the pupils chance to talk about themselves, and they can lead the discussion, and the teacher doesn't even need to know anything. So that is what we've developed. It's a full curriculum. We are a charity, and it's therefore provided free at the point of delivery, as we'd say about the NHS in this country. And I think it's fair to say that the response of teachers, and there are hundreds of schools making use of it, is, as I would say this, wouldn't I? Very positive, because actually the kids are delighted to find a voice and find a chance to rehearse it. And actually Mukhtar, who has taught this in Birmingham primary schools as a senior pupil, he, I think, would give a much better account of what he felt it was like when he was doing it.
Sure. Well, we'll come back to Mukhtar on that point then in just a moment, if we may. But first, so if I understand correctly, maybe in a word, you're saying that rather than or in addition to teaching individual languages, we can teach a subject called languages. So language diversity packed in itself in a subject. And it reminds me of some ideas that I've had that I've published also in this book, my recent book, Speech in the City, about the academic setting, rather not the school setting, where I talk about the concept of locality studies. So why not, if we're training people for managerial positions, whether it's in business or in government, every large city now, part of taking on a managerial role has to involve reaching out to linguistically diverse populations. So why not have a course on locality studies, which would take into account language diversity and equip people to be able to do that? So in that context of the work of Wallo, can we go back a step and reflect on the three other contributions that we've had to the panel so far? Where do you see a prospect, or where are you already addressing issues of language flexibility, for example, in marketing and business, for example, in reclaiming terminology, for example, in embracing multilingual identities? I mean, are they considered already or just spontaneously? I mean, do you see space for taking some of those insights and packaging them along with other content into this general awareness of language diversity that you are working to strengthen?
Well, I think what is interesting is that having been a teacher, I think one of the dangers is that it's you in your small corner and I in mine. Most of the people and organizations I've come in touch with over the last few years, I knew nothing about, but every conversation I have is revelatory. And you talk about me being old and wise. I think it's more like King Lear. I'm old before thou art old, before thou art wise. And I feel I've learned so much too late in my retirement that I should have known 30 years ago. To be honest, if Anser would like to contribute a lesson on the difficulty of finding the right vocabulary for branding, my nephew works for Procter & Gamble, so you better watch out. But but all these things, and also what Ioana was saying about the issues of generational problems. One of the things we think about Wallo is that there's no doubt in Britain, for example, we may have migrant parents who speak their family language very well, but not English particularly. You've got the parents who may do both, and the children who are being driven by examinations and SATs and 11 pluses and passing things into being monolingual English. And perhaps Mukhtar could talk about that too. And so trying to construct something whereby the children are proud of the languages that they have is going to be very important, I think, for the preservation of that sense of family. And Mukhtar talking about feeling distance from his own family, that's a pretty scary thing. School was never quite meant to do that, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. Well, let's we've got a few questions now from the chat, which I'll come back to in a moment. But first, I'd like to go back to Mukhtar and then briefly to Ioana as well. So Mukhtar, can we go back to John's suggestion to tell us a little bit about your experience, just very briefly, in teaching or working with the Wallo package in a primary school? What was that like?
It was great. It was really enjoyable to teach, which I think says something. I think before I taught Wallo, I did teach general language workshops as well. And sometimes you'd come across a class or a session where it felt like a drag. But with all my sessions teaching Wallo, I don't think there was a dip or a low point, because you don't run out of material, you don't run out of new, exciting, engaging information, because what you're drawing on is the knowledge of the students, the knowledge that the students have already, whether or not they're aware of that.
Can you give us an example of how it works? Just a short example of a session. How would you organize a session?
There was like Mr. Clausen mentioned, there was like a days of the week session where we explored the days of the week in English, where those terms came from. We looked at their counterparts in Romance languages, and then we went around the room and asked people how they, what they called the days of the week in their own native language. And like where we drew connections between English and between Romance languages, we draw the same connections between the languages that they spoke. There was a really interesting instance where I had in one class, I had one table, and when we started the activity using their native languages, they found out that they all spoke Farsi. But this was towards the end of the year, a year 5 class. They'd been together 5 years, but they never actually really acknowledged or clocked onto the fact that they all spoke the same language. It was only after doing something really simple, just asking them what the days of the week in their language were, that they realized, wait, there's something else that we share here, aside from just being in the same class.
Right.
So yeah, it's activities like that which start out with something a bit familiar and then move on to individual experiences.
Thank you. Ioana, in the communities that you've worked in, was there any effort within the communities to use education and teaching or work with young people to raise awareness of their languages, or is that only done in the family in an informal way? Were there any kind of teaching packages used to try and raise awareness of the ancestral languages?
In both communities that I mentioned, the Kalmyk and the Sephardim, I haven't encountered so far such an initiative within the school or within kindergarten or within a formal setting to cultivate awareness about the heritage language. Quite on the contrary. I know this initiative existed in Kalmykia in the past, right away after they returned from the deportation in 1957. But they died out within 10 years. And then the culture of Russian-only mostly was cultivated. But such initiatives or cultivated in language clubs, both in Kalmykia or in cultural centers in Istanbul, where people gather around these activities and they create materials, they translate books or help or assist in that. They create WhatsApp groups or language apps where they can communicate with the broadest Sephardic community. To such an extent, that Ladino Judeo-Spanish has become, has been named as a cyber vernacular, in the sense that it exists now on the online communication mainly. So yes, there are these initiatives, but not in the formal setting.
That is really interesting, because that addresses one of the questions that we had from James, who asks, to what extent has the use of digital media led to homogenization? Presumably that means everybody speaks the same language or writes in the same way. And to what extent has it facilitated multilingual communication? And I guess what you're suggesting is that the use of digital media at least helps preserve a language that is otherwise retreating from many domains. And so it contributes to what we might call language vitality. And in that sense, also more broadly to multilingualism, because it allows people to embrace various parts of their multilingual repertoire. And I'd like to come back to Anser here on this question. Digital media is something that, in your experience, companies use strategically in order to facilitate communication in different languages beyond what you would expect anyway. Obviously, digital media are used, but is there a particular reflection around digital media that it would allow, for example, certain languages to be incorporated or translation to be done more easily, perhaps through auto translation? Have you come across any kind of strategic reflections around the use of digital media for multilingualism?
I would defer to what John said earlier, that even the best of AI so far falls short. You simply can't rely on it. So two aspects of digital media that I'll bring about. One is we have been using digital media, not even now, but even since 10 years ago, to just get a gauge of sentiment. What is being discussed in the digital stratosphere about the brand, good or bad? So that's where you can literally try and go into chat forums and extract wherever a certain brand is being mentioned and what's the sentiment. And clearly, with it being discussed in different languages, that's super helpful. And that gets us an idea of, is there a looming crisis, or is there a negative sentiment, and why, and can we address it? The other thing about digital media, very interestingly, Yaron, is the shift away from languages. So the best advertising is one that has the least number of words. Words are the enemy of a marketer. And if visually you can just convey what you need to, so that it doesn't become a barrier at all. Because remember, while we have the luxury to talk about languages, there are scores of people, bless them, where literacy on its own is a challenge. So big parts of Africa, India, where we not even the first rung of the ladder is language, but there's a lot at the bottom of the pyramid. So we are really making advances where, with the least number of words, can we visually still convey. And we have some great classic examples of campaigns that have done wonders just through cartoons or imagery.
Right. Thank you. There's another question in the chat from Morag. Can you tell us how many speakers a language must have to be endangered? So what's our criterion for calling a language endangered, or even a minority language, especially if it's in its native country? So a language you mean, I'm assuming not the language of immigrants that have moved somewhere else, but they've been there, they've always been there. But their language is being compromised because another language is in power. So does a minority language has to be restricted to being spoken in a small area? Is about the number of speakers? And is that relevant to defining it as endangered? And maybe we can go back to Ioana on this point, because you've also used the term language endangerment, language shift. Do we have any idea, what is a minority language? What are endangered languages?
Maybe we don't speak so much in terms of number of speakers. According to UNESCO framework of endangered languages, we have several categorization. We have safe, where everybody still speaks the language. We have vulnerable, where it's still spoken also by some children. We have definitely endangered, where children no longer speak the language. And we have severely endangered, where only the older generation speaks the language. And then we have extinct, where the language is not spoken anymore. So you can have in some communities 700 speakers or 700 people in that particular group. And if they all speak the language, then yeah, that's a safe language. Whereas in another community, you may have only 700 people speaking the language, but then only the elderly then puts it in an endangered classification type.
And what's the role of this classification? I know that international agencies such as UNESCO and sometimes the Council of Europe perhaps have been looking at these criteria because if they award resources or status, they need some kind of objective criteria to base that on. But what about people's attitudes? Do they play a role in deciding whether language is safe and we can it'll continue, or whether it needs some support? How active are speaker communities in communicating their needs about languages in your experience?
I think we still have a long way in this path to go before we integrate, or we can integrate the language attitudes of the speakers toward their languages in measures such as language preservation, or in state-led measures of support towards the revitalization of that language. Usually we do not go into these questions because attitudes is also something that is very complex to assess. First of all, and it's related with a long time, longitudinal studies, intergenerational studies. It's something that is not easy. And then we have the difference between implicit attitudes, which are hidden, and explicit attitudes. So I give just one example to realize that in the Sephardi community, I had Mordo, and this is not his real name, who said, I don't like the language. This language is ugly. They do a lot of language mixing. This is not my language. When talking to his mother, I realized that his language attitudes were shaped by his grandfather's experience in labor camps, where they associated using Judeo-Spanish with threat and fear. Therefore, they did not transmit a language. However, when I talked to his daughter, Sandy, again, not her real name, I found out that he actually likes the language. He likes to embed in his literary writings Judeo-Spanish, and he listens to Sephardic music. So in order to find out these attitudes, and there's different layers of implicit and explicit, I needed 3 generations and in-depth interviews. Therefore, this is something that is quite difficult to assess, and it needs both quantitative, qualitative analysis or approaches.
So in other words, like many things in life, labeling and categorizing is not really that simple. There is a real risk of essentializing if we say this language is like this and this language is like that, because there are various contradictory trends and trajectories, and we have to observe what people are doing, listen to what people want to happen. Back to you, John, on a related point. You've told us about how different structures of language, facts about language are taken into consideration in the Wallo curriculum. And I was wondering whether there is room, and perhaps you've already given this consideration and incorporated some things, or if not, would you in the future? And if so, how would you go about doing that? Namely, looking at what we might call the sociological or sociolinguistic or social-political conditions of language. So teaching about for example, what is language endangerment? What is language shift? Why do people abandon a language and embrace another one? How does digital mean? What do they do in order to strengthen their language? Would things like that fit in principle into the Wolo curriculum?
No, I think they do. And as you talk about the multilingualism of Manchester, and I keep on, whenever I do a MACFEST thing, I just think Birmingham should be doing the same, because in a sense, Birmingham is even more diverse. And I live in a very diverse, community here. I think that it's almost become a political issue of real substance. And I think that's, and the opening of your book is about this, is that I don't know what we can do, but at the moment there is, in the political debate, quite a lot of stuff about the fact if you're a migrant and you don't want to learn the English language, or you are happy to continue to speak in your heritage language, then somehow or other you don't belong, or you don't have British values. Some extraordinary things have been said about migrants who have medieval values or even no values at all. So I think there's a really important battle to be won about the nature of, as you've described, about locality, about understanding the different natures of communities, valuing them. You talk about eating curry in Birmingham, etc. But if you look at the average cricket team, it's mainly people playing. It's mainly Muslims who are playing like Indians and Pakistanis who are playing like crazy. And I think it's a very, very important thing and that's why I think this kind of conversation across so many threads of the argument, whereby actually giving value to these languages, even though some of these languages, some of my very able former pupils, their families spoke a language which has never been a written language. But even so, I think it's really important that somehow or other we lay aside this notion of, we seem to be muddling integration with assimilation. Of course, we want our society to be integrated, but I don't necessarily think that surely does not mean that we all have to end up being like me. What a dreadful thought. And so I think it's really important that people can value their culture, be committed to their historic identity and their personal identity, as Mukhtar is, whilst at the same time being loyal and deeply committed to the country that they're living in. I don't think you have to sacrifice your past to belong somewhere in the present. And I think that is where the whole language debate is at its most significant, and that debate has got sadly uglier in recent times. And I say this as the chief master of King Edward School, where Enoch Powell was one of our most famous alumni. But what has been said recently about people belonging and whatever is, I think, materially more damaging than what Enoch said in his famous Rivers of Blood speech 50 years ago.
Yes, well, I'm not sure if everybody who's joining us this evening knows who Enoch Powell was and what he said. This was briefly a speech with a lot of incitement against immigration in the mid or late 1960s. We have, and there was another question here from the chat, whether anti-multilingualism, anti-language suspicion toward languages is connected to nationalistic and xenophobic discourse. I write about that actually in my book, the recent book, Speech in the City. The first chapter of the book is called Linguophobia, so the fear of languages. And I describe how at national level, the example that I look at is the UK and the public debates around before and after the Brexit referendum, how fear of languages was being mobilized for a political agenda in particular, this idea that language is a zero-sum game. So precisely what, John, what you addressed. So the idea that if you hold on to your background language, then that's a deficient form of citizenship. You can't possibly learn English well if you hold on to your other language. So this idea that is zero-sum, so either this language or that language, you can't have both, or you can't have multiple languages. And structurally, that's expressed in many ways in UK society, including, for example, in the census, which asks about language. But the UK census asks you to identify your main language, and you can only put down one. And so ignores a large part of the population that actually use alternate languages at home. And it also doesn't explain what main is. The main can be, different to different people. It can be the language that you use most hours of the day, or the language that you're most comfortable with, or emotionally most attached with. For quite a few years, I tried to persuade the Office for National Statistics in the UK to amend the question, make it more realistic, go down the path that some other countries have, allowing people to list the languages that they use. But I found that the officers who were in charge of the census were quite sympathetic, but there were political forces restricting them from doing that, because the question in the census in the UK about main language leads to the question, how well do you know English? And what they really want to know is which populations fail to learn English, not what sort of language resources culturally and elsewhere we have. Now, looking back at the chat, there are, I have to say, I'm just as a my personal opinion is I get very confused about chats, because we have questions and then we have some participants responding to the questions. We have parallel conversations going on. So sometimes I find it hard to discern what is a question and what is a comment and what has also received in reply, but I'll do my best. I'll come back to one issue that was raised earlier on in the evening and in the comments in the chat. And then before we bring this to a close, I'll give an opportunity for one more question to come on the chat, which we'll put to our panelists. And if you do want to ask a question, please just start with the word question, and then we'll know that that's a question and we can put that back to the panel. The one thing that I want to come back to and pick up on that was an issue of translation that was addressed by a couple of our participants, Morag and Steve, and perhaps also somebody else. And this is an issue that was addressed in the press yesterday in the UK about the BBC's reporting on the conflict of Gaza. And there was an interview in Arabic with a resident of Gaza who used in Arabic the phrase "Njahid ضد اليهود." In Arabic, it's a verb. It starts with a verb and then against a population, and the BBC translated that as resistance against the Israeli forces. There was criticism of that translation, with people saying, well, actually, literally, it means to carry out jihad. So jihad is a verb in Arabic. It means to carry out jihad. But jihad can also be a holy war, but it can also be resistance. There's a range of meanings against the Jews rather than the Israeli forces. I actually also participated, and I commented that there were some critical voices about the BBC. Some even suggested that the BBC deliberately mistranslated in order to downplay meaning. My personal impression, and I know Arabic, and I think I know the context by many years, my personal impression is that in context, Yahud, the word Jew, is used to refer to the Israeli army, and jihad is used not just to carry out jihad as a holy war to eradicate or convert others to Islam. It's also used to denote resistance. So I actually found that the translation, from my perspective, as I know the situation and the language involved, was quite accurate. But the problem of that is that there's an intertwining. There isn't just a one-to-one symbolic meaning of one word in another language. So indeed, in jihad can mean both resistance, but it can also mean a holy war. And Yahud can mean, in context, the Israeli army. It can also mean Jews in general. So there is an ambivalence, and that brings us to this difficulty of translation that we touched on at the beginning of the conversation. Can we translate cultures from one to another? Are there words that guide us to particular cultural contexts? And it becomes politically sensitive and very charged when we're talking about situations that are so emotionally charged and so political as, for example, the conflict in Gaza now or elsewhere. We know that in history, many peoples were not allowed to refer to themselves by their name. So the Kurdish language, for example, in Turkey for many years was banned from being mentioned as a Kurdish language, as an independent language. There are other countries, still fewer and fewer, luckily, but there are countries around the world that prevent or put pressure on population not to name their languages in a particular way. And again, a need arises to reclaim terminology and reclaim identity in that way. So I don't see another question, and therefore I think we can just take the opportunity to close the conversation. Thank our panelists again for their insights from so many different areas of life experience, work experience, and interests. We've brought things together. I believe, or I know, the session has been recorded. It will at some point be put on the MACFEST online archive, and we will also link to it from the City of Languages website when it's there. You'll have an opportunity to share it with your friends, and we will also promote it. And so thanks again, and I'll hand back to Katarzyna for a final word of farewell. Thank you and good evening.
Yaron, thank you so much. What a wonderful event. Thank you to all the panelists. It was absolutely amazing, fascinating chat as well. Thank you to our public. Thank you for bringing in all the different views on the languages. Also, thank you to Anser for taking us on a journey into using the language in a way that can connect us to the emotions, also through the visuals. Thank you, John, for bringing something that gave me a feeling of a fusion of language and cultural identity, and also on touching on the AI. I'm not sure how many people have explored the AI, but I did a little bit, the ChatGPT, and I've got to say, it feels like a dead language to me when it starts producing some text when you ask questions. So I can definitely feel the difference between the actual language that is alive and we speak, we can connect to, and the language that is created artificially in a way. However, with the AI, it's an open source, so it's up to us to bring in as much information in any language that is important to you as possible. So I encourage everybody to use the open sources. So before we go, I would just like to remind, especially those who have been late today, that we've got the National Muslim Arts Awards submission process starting on the 1st of March. And we also have Muslim Artists Network opening on the 1st of March, the process for joining, and the membership is free. We are starting the Ramadan festival now with 2 events coming up. One this coming Saturday at 2 o'clock, Cooking with the Blind Chef, Ibrahim Iqbal. And then on Sunday, also 2 o'clock London time, we've got Celebrating Ramadan in the Philippines. So before you go, I do encourage you to follow MACFEST on social media. If you have missed our opening ceremony or you were not able to attend it, you can watch it on YouTube. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to MACFEST newsletter to keep up with all the upcoming events. You can book the events on Eventbrite. Most of the events are free. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you to Kezra for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you.